Well, I mean, I think it's to say for the record, it's full solidarity with those very brave people, young people, women taking enormous risks in confronting the authorities and calling for freedom. It's immensely moving and impressive to see such a these protests, which are very exciting and inspiring for those of us following from overseas. So if anybody from Iran is watching, bravo, full solidarity from me, and I'm sure from many of my compatriots too. I should also say, I think as a British person, I'm well aware and want to acknowledge Britain's past role in Iran's history and its own repression of democracy, and how that might have contributed to the authoritarian regime that the protesters confront today. So I wanted to acknowledge that as well. Yeah, absolutely. Well, the two big examples of leaderless movements, leaderless revolutions that have been successful in recent years are Tunisia and Ukraine, both of which are fairly recent. Tunisia led to the overthrow of the Ben Ali regime within 23 days of the protests starting, which were triggered by a young man setting fire to himself in a country town in Tunisia. So that demonstrates that these leaderless protests can have enormous effect very quickly. Ukraine, it took longer, but the Euromaidan protests were to a large extent leaderless. There were some people who emerged as spokespersons for that movement, but it wasn't a directed movement, and the protests began spontaneously. That's the critical thing. So there's no reason to think that the protests in Iran won't be successful. But the determining criterion is not only, of course, the breadth and extent of the protests themselves, which is critical, but also the reaction of the regime, to what extent it is willing to use violence to sustain itself. And there we can see, of course, many more negative examples, such as Syria, where the Assad regime chose to use violence to suppress pro-democracy protests, widespread protests in Syria, leading to a civil war, which continues to this day. So I don't think anybody can say what is going to happen in Iran, and certainly not outsiders like me. But there's no reason to think that a leaderless movement won't succeed. The advantage of leaderless movements is not only that self-reinforcing nature that they kind of spread and people inspire each other across the web of connections, but also, of course, they are very, very hard for authoritarian regimes to deal with. An authoritarian regime with its secret police, its Republican guards or whatnot, is very well set up to deal with more traditional orthodox kinds of opposition, the emergence of particular opposition groups or opposition leaders who can be easily decapitated, removed, imprisoned, or executed. Of course, that's impossible with a leaderless movement. There are no leaders who you can pick off. People say that the disadvantage of leaderless movements is that you don't have a group that's presenting a coherent agenda which can then be negotiated with the authorities. I'm not so sure that's true, because the demands of the protests in Iran are very clear. Therefore, respect for the rights of women, for freedom for women, but also for broader democratic reform and the end of the authoritarian regime. You don't need to be a genius to see those demands. You don't need to have those articulated in a manifesto. Perhaps if there were some kind of negotiation between the regime and the protesters, then you might see the emergence of a leadership group. But that leadership group would always struggle for legitimacy, because it's a plural, widespread movement of protests. And in the past, when we've seen leaderless movements, when leaders have kind of nominated themselves as spokespeople for these movements, they've been denounced by others in the movement as illegitimate. I mean, the essence of these movements is they are many voices, they are plural, they are not singular, they are asking for pluralism, for democracy, for respect, for rights across the board. That's what makes them so important as an expression of the need for democracy and pluralism, and the protection of human rights for all minorities, for women, for minorities, whether Kurdish, Baha'i, or others in Iran, but a multiplicity of voices. That's their power, that's their excitement. For a Westerner, let me just say it's very inspiring to see this. It does have an effect. These protests have already had an effect. They have already, in a sense, been successful in marking very clearly the limits of tolerance for state repression, and state repression above all of women's rights and women's freedom in Iran. So something very important has already happened that will have an effect. I can't tell you what that effect will be, but it will inspire many people around the world, perhaps most of all in the Middle East. I don't know. But of course, if you follow the Middle East closely, this isn't the first time there's been a kind of women-led revolution. A similar thing has happened in northeast Syria, in a place the Kurds call Rojava, which has a very interesting connection to what's going on in Iran now, because the Women, Life, Freedom slogan comes from a Kurdish leader, Abdullah Öcalan, who's currently imprisoned by Turkey, and whose writings inspired the women-led revolution in Rojava. And there's another thread through there is we can see the role of feminist thinking and feminist activism in the Kurdish liberation movement, both the Turkish Kurdish liberation movement, PKK, but more broadly. And it's striking that this revolutionary movement, this mass movement, has begun in the Kurdish areas with because of the tragic death of a young Kurdish woman. There is that element in these protests, which have now spread to embrace a much broader representation of the Iranian population. What they're trying to pretend is that this is a foreign-inspired protest movement. So they're hitting Kurdish groups in northern Iraq, for instance. They're blaming the US and others for these protests, when clearly they're not foreign-inspired. Clearly they are spontaneous and indigenous to Iran itself. They come from deep-seated sense of resentment and disaffection within Iran, particularly about women's rights, but not only about women's rights, about a broader set of concerns from an authoritarian regime, including economic concerns, political concerns, concerns about freedom of speech and political rights in general. That is not foreign inspired. And regimes, authoritarian regimes, like to pretend they are foreign inspired because it means they are not to blame. Their disastrous government of the country is not to blame. But also it's the way authoritarian regimes think. They want there to be a kind of singular cause for these kind of movements against them, for these revolts against them. They are in a way very singular in the way that they think. They think that they are a singular entity. There must be a singular kind of threat. This is why leaderless mass movements are so difficult for them to deal with, because they can't put their finger on where exactly this comes from. What is the origin of this? The origin of this is a very widespread sense of disenfranchisement and resentment. That's the origin of it. It's not a particular revolutionary group. It's not an individual. It's not a political group. It's not a foreign actor. It is notable that these protests seem to involve a disproportionate number of young people, and of course of women too. That gives it a particular power. Young people are the future of any country. If they are disaffected, then the regime has a real problem. There may be an age dimension to this, that the older people in Iran are seen as more pro the revolution, the Shah, the revolution of 1979, that the older generation is more associated with that perhaps, but that's only speculating. These movements tend to be younger. In Egypt, we saw, for instance, the Tahrir Square movement was quite a young movement. Obviously, younger people are more familiar with social media. They're more connected with it. They're more aware of the possibilities of democracy and a freer culture because they're more connected to the internet. It may be just as simple as that. Well, I've got one thought, which is that one of the risks of leaderless movements is, and this, again, I'm not an expert on Iranian history, please don't get me wrong, but in 1979, there were very widespread protests against the Shah, which were not just of Khomeini's supporters. Khomeini appeared, and to a degree, that faction then exploited and co-opted a broader popular revolution to put forward their own agenda. For what revolution should look like, and produced an authoritarian dispensation that has lasted to this day. And that is a danger. In Egypt, we saw a similar thing happen where it's a complicated story and I don't want to oversimplify it, but an Islamist movement to an extent co-opted the popular protests against the Mubarak regime in order to come to power. I'm not saying this is particularly an Islamist thing, but it is definitely a risk of leaderless movements that a more organized movement can then come in and claim to speak for the popular voice, claim to speak for all the people involved in the leaderless movement. Very clear to me in Iran that what we're talking about is a demand for democracy. It's not a particular kind of democracy. It is democracy where everybody can have a voice, where all rights are respected. And I think it's really important that that demand is reiterated, and that if a group emerges who tries to co-opt that agenda, that it is resisted.